Hey friends, greetings from the Golan Heights. My name is Dalton Thomas. My dear friend Joel Richardson and I are doing a series of videos discussing and exploring the backdrop, the past, the present, the future implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So each video we're taking a different subject or topic. Joel kicked it off a few days ago with kind of a big picture overview. I've been addressing a number of issues in the previous sessions, dealing with the media, dealing with the issue of neo-Nazis. We're going to be dealing with the military situation, the historical backdrop to it, the future implications of it, talking about it from a Middle Eastern perspective, an Far Eastern perspective, a Western perspective. There's a lot of implications. This is the most significant military conflict since World War II in terms of the implications of where this thing could go because of how connected it is to global dynamics right now, not just in the West, but particularly in the Middle East and as well in the Far East. This is going to have global ramifications and consequences on our generation in a massive way that I think will even eclipse the impact of 9/11, which is pretty significant statement because 9/11 set off a chain reaction of events that completely changed the face of world history in a massive way. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in the end, in terms of the gravity of the implications of this, will eclipse 9/11 in terms of the severity of it and where this thing is going to go. In this session today, I want to address the issue of biolabs. Biolabs is now all over the internet, it's all over the news, it's all over social media, and it's a very strange piece of the Russia-Ukraine puzzle that has been thrust to the forefront and put in the center of the discussion and the debate in many circles about the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what I want to do today is go through the issue of the biolabs controversy, but I want to deal with it not from an angle of hopefully from an angle that is helpful, not discussing necessarily the biolabs, which we'll get to that because it needs to be discussed, especially in light of the recent emphasis on it. But what I hope that this session is actually what it's intended to be is a critique of information acquisition, meaning particularly in the West, and if you're an American or you're from the Western world, this video is actually really aimed at you. It's not so much aimed at the Middle East per se or even the Far East. This is definitely aimed at the Western European, American, Canadian audience because this is the part of the world that's being impacted and affected the most by this whole issue of information acquisition. We live in an open source generation where information is at our fingertips, and because it's at our fingertips, everyone's allegedly an expert on everything because of what they read on Instagram or what they found on Twitter. So what I want to do today is as we go through the history of this biolab situation and the history of it, what it is, what it isn't, and how it came to be such a jugular issue for so many people, what I hope that you can take from this is some clarity on how to, or how not to, I should say, obtain information about current events, specifically ones that have deep-rooted historical, geopolitical, military, ethnic, religious, philosophical implications and backdrop. Let me tell you a story before we get into it. As an organization, we work in conflict zones, FAI, Frontier Alliance International. We have been working in conflict zones all over the Middle East for the last decade plus, and one of the priority areas or countries that we work in is the nation of Syria. We've had the privilege to serve civilians caught in the crossfire of this brutal, horrific war that started 11 years ago, yesterday actually. So we're 11 years in to what started as a secular revolution, which then turned into a jihadist winter, and it turned into a brutal, horrific civil war that is still ongoing, and it shows no signs of letting up. There will be no victory in Syria. One night, I was here in Israel, in the Golan Heights. I was coordinating one of our flagship initiatives at the time, which was in coordination with the Israeli army. We would send in civilian healthcare providers into civilian centers in southern Syria and provide healthcare. We established a birth clinic, pediatric centers, casualty collection points. We were dealing with trauma and family care, pediatric care, and aiming particularly at the civilian population. Now, the Israeli army was evacuating the sick and the wounded at the time to hospitals here in Israel. They would treat them for free and then send them back to Syria once they would recover. It was called Operation Good Neighbor. It was a very beautiful project. We're very privileged to be a part of it. One night, I get a message from one of our team leaders who was in a place that was very near to Damascus. And this place was subject to horrific bombing campaigns throughout the revolution. It was an area that was very cornered, put it that way, between different forces, and they had very limited mobility. And this was a place that received an incredible amount of airstrikes and shelling and mortars and rockets and Syrian bombardment on a daily basis, and as well Russian-backed and Russian-executed airstrikes as well. Now, one night I get a video of a chemical attack. There was people brought in because there was an attack out on the front lines, and the community got hit with a particular chemical weapon. And so the wounded and the sick and the people that were around it came in, and I'm getting the video of the chemical attack. Now, we know the people who were on the ground gasping for air. They're people that we have relationship. We know them. We know the story. We were in the village when it happened. We know where it happened. We know from where everything came, and then we can confirm it was the use of chemical weapons. Now, what happened in social media, now this is, to be clear, this is Syria, Assad, backed by the Russians, attacking a Sunni Syrian opposition-held area in southern Syria, and chemical attack, and with the use of chemical weapons as they attack and try to break this community down. Now, the point is this is very consistent with Syrian and Russian military methodology, is to, if you can't win militarily, you terrorize the civilian population and break their will until finally the military objective is accomplished. Meaning, if you can't beat the soldiers, if you can't beat the people, if the soldiers can't beat the soldiers, the Syrian and Russian method of securing the territory is to heavily bombard the civilian population and break their will. Now, the use of chemical weapons is used to degrade them at the end of it. So we've seen this time and time again in Syria, is that there will be military clashes at the beginning, and then the Syrian and Russian military will fail to meet their military objectives, and then they will pummel the civilian population. They'll just destroy the town. They'll target the hospitals, target the schools, they'll target everything civilian, because the goal is to break the psychology of the civilian population, because if you can break the civilian population, it's going to put the pressure upon the governmental, or in this case military leadership, because if the civilian people that they're protecting can turn from a point of resistance to a point of saying, let's surrender because our will is broken, then the military objective can be accomplished. That's the basic Russian doctrine of war. If you can't obtain a military objective, break the will of the civilian population, then you can bend the will of the military or government leadership, then you can secure the area, which is what happened. They broke the will of the people, then they ended up breaking the will of the military leadership, then they were able to secure the area, disarm them, humiliate them, and essentially alienate and ostracize the community. These communities today are still living without basic necessities after the liberation of these areas from opposition control. Now the regime controls it. Now the point is this: that night with the chemical attack, I have the video on my phone. I sent it to a number of journalists, and I'm watching on social media, and I'm seeing that there's reports of a chemical attack, and then what ends up happening is, in social media and on Twitter and Instagram, there emerges this narrative that the opposition, the Syrian rebels, did a false flag operation and used chemical weapons as a pretext to try to provoke intervention, either from the Israelis or from the Americans or the Jordanians, that someone would intervene and attack the regime. because the argument goes the Syrian regime and the Russians wouldn't use chemical weapons. Why would they use chemical weapons? Because Obama drew the red line, said if you use chemical weapons, we're going to intervene. And the thing is, Assad ended up using chemical weapons. The proof was given to the Obama administration. The Obama administration did not make good on their word that they would intervene in the event of the use of chemical weapons. So what did that tell Assad and Putin? Continue to use chemical weapons, continue the methodology. Now, what ended up happening time and time again is whenever the regime and the Russians would use chemical weapons, they would blame the rebels for it, they would blame the opposition for it, and they would say they're the ones who used the chemical weapons. It was a false flag. They set it off, they bombed their own civilian center, they're the ones who did the chemical attack, and they're using it as a pretext. We would never do that. This, in a nutshell, is basic Russian and Syrian methodology in war. It's consistent. The examples of this there are so many examples of this. This is not like a one-off thing. Now, we were involved in a number of these, meaning our teams, our medical providers were on the ground taking care of people who were being affected by chemical attacks. But this is not a one-off thing. This happened across Syria, wherever the regime was fighting opposition leadership. Now, the thing is, Russia is not going to change its methodology in Ukraine. This is the basic methodology. You lead with a military objective. When you can't meet the military objective, you obliterate the civilian population and you forcibly evacuate and expel the civilian population until there's a small resistance left in the city, and then you pummel them, and you pummel them, and you pummel them, and then you break their will in the end with the use of chemical weapons, because it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Meaning this is what, if you really want to break the will of somebody, don't just conduct airstrikes. Pollute the air that they breathe so that the breathing itself destroys your body. This is the use of chemical weapons. Now, the Russians are not the only ones who do this, but the Russians are consistent in doing this time and time and time again. And it's what they're doing in Ukraine right now. They invaded on the 24th of February. They did not meet their military objective. Now they're moving on to phase 2 of the methodology. Pummel the civilian centers and create fake humanitarian corridors. And in the humanitarian corridors, don't actually do humanitarian corridors, which further psychologically messes with the civilian population. Then pummel them, and pummel them some more, and pummel them some more, and then use some chemical weapons, and say that the chemical weapons were used by the people that are being pummeled, and that you are actually liberating the people that they're pummeling. This is basic Syrian and Russian war methodology, and it's happening right now. So, what's the issue with the biolabs? I'm on Twitter, and it's all over Twitter right now. Biolabs. Tucker Carlson, Marco Rubio, Mitt Romney. Everyone's debating about biolabs. Let's talk about biolabs for a bit and talk about the controversy of this, and we'll come back to Syrian-Russian methodology that's being used in Ukraine right now. Because Ukraine, what I would encourage you to do is look at Syria and then take that and look at Ukraine. That's basically what's going to happen in Ukraine. You're going to have pockets of resistance and opposition. You're going to have opposition-held areas. You're going to have this same methodology that I just described, and you're going to have this dynamic of intervention where the international community will say, here's a red line. If this happens, we will do this, which basically sets the terms for Putin to make a decision on how far he can go and how much it will cost him if he does that. For example, when Joe Biden says, hey, we've already made the decision, we're not going to intervene militarily in Ukraine. We're just going to support them financially, and we're going to impose sanctions on Russia. That is a green light. That's political diplomatic language for saying you have a green light, meaning you don't tell another government and military, we're not going to intervene militarily. We've already made the decision. That's basically saying, okay, do what you want. We're not going to engage. We're only going to engage on these fields and fronts, but we're not going to engage on this field or this front. So what we're going to see now is lots of talking from the West, and you're going to see lots of deciding in the East, meaning China is making up its mind right now how it's going to respond. Iran is making up its mind. Turkey is making up its mind. Israel's making up their mind, trying to figure out how to position themselves in this mounting conflict between the West, we can call it the democratic liberal West, And then we can call it the clash with totalitarian Russia and all that that represents. As this clash is happening, the rest of the world is deciding how they're going to position in that. NATO is going to be talking. EU is going to be talking. Joe Biden's going to be talking. And Putin is going to continue on with his methodology, just like we saw in Syria. For the last 11 years, the international community has been talking, and Assad and Putin have been, and the regime in Tehran and Hezbollah have been having an absolute field day in Syria with absolute impunity. They can do whatever they want. The use of chemical weapons is only one of the major injustices that's been perpetrated time and time again in Syria, with no one really cares in the international community. We're just going to talk about it and impose sanctions. And to be clear, the Syrian regime has been under sanctions now for a very long time, and they're still in power, and the country is still in shambles, and the country is still stained with blood and as divided, if not more divided, than it was 11 years ago. Meaning there's no victory in this thing, and sanctions don't really do anything in the end. Sanctions, what they do is not what we say they do on the nightly news, and we say we're imposing crippling sanctions and it's going to crush Russia. It's going to hurt Russia. It's not going to crush Russia any more than the sanctions crushed Tehran or the sanctions crushed Damascus. The regime still held in power. The sanctions affected the nation and the community, but it didn't actually affect the regime in the end. Now it pinched them and hurt them, but it did not cripple them or destroy them. The regime is still in power in Tehran, and the regime is still in power in Damascus, and the regime will still be in power in Moscow, regardless of how much sanctions are imposed upon them. Now, does it become a negotiating tool? Maybe. It depends. Depends how China throws down. Depends on what happens with Turkey and Israel. Depends on a couple of other key players. But in the end, sanctions are not going to do anything decisive in this war, even though I think it's not entirely useless. It's not going to accomplish something very decisive. So, let's talk about, with that in mind, let's talk about biolabs. Now, the invasion started on February 24th. Now, there was two basic reasons. Putin gave a speech. Now, let me back up a little bit. For months leading up to the invasion, the official statement, time and time again, from the Russian government was the West is spreading disinformation and propaganda saying that we are going to invade Ukraine. We're not. It's propaganda. Now, you can go through all of the embassies, the Russian embassies in pretty much every country where Russia has an embassy. You can look at their Twitter account, and if you look in February, January, December, November, you can see them tweeting in unison saying the West is spreading propaganda. The West is saying that Russia is going to take military action and intervene in Ukraine and invade Ukraine. These are lies, patented lies. There was press releases, there was statements, there were speeches, there was documents denying an invasion was going to take place. Complete denial for months. Denial. Then troops start massing around the border. And the U.S. government released its intelligence and says, here's all the figures, the numbers, this is what's going to happen. They're going to invade Ukraine. Still, the Russians say, we're not going to invade Ukraine. You guys are spreading disinformation and propaganda. We have no interest in invading Ukraine. And the Americans said, no, it's going to happen. They're going to invade Ukraine. Everyone get ready. We don't know when. It's going to happen any day now. It's going to happen. The regime in Moscow continues to deny it up until February 24th. Now, on February 24th, when the invasion started, there was two main pretexts. There was more, but the two main talking point pretexts was, number one, the denazification of Ukraine. That Ukraine is committing genocide. This is the language that Putin used. And then he needs to liberate Ukraine from the people who are inflicting the genocide upon Ukrainians and upon Russians. That was one of the main talking points. The other main talking point was the threat of Western powers encroaching on Russia's borders, specifically through the expansion of NATO. Now, in another session, we're going to talk about NATO and this talking point. But the point is this. When the invasion began on the 24th, this was the main reason. Nazis and NATO. That's the two main reasons. There was other reasons. Putin gave a very long speech, and he gave lots of information about why he's doing it, the backdrop to it, the logic behind it, that it wasn't just some, woke up in the morning pissed off and said, let's go invade a country. That there was a long backdrop to this. He went back to 2014. He went through the revolution. He explained everything. He said, and the end of the line is we need to denazify this place because it's run by Nazis. And two, we need to make sure that NATO doesn't expand upon our borders in Ukraine. Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO. Now, again, we'll talk about that later. I'm tempted to jump on the NATO thing now, but I'll bite my tongue for now and hold off until we can do a proper session on it. Now, what happened is they made the talking points. They did the invasion. It was a very, fast attempted blitzkrieg. And then what did we see happen was the Russian military got bogged down and they didn't make any significant advances. They lost more soldiers in 2 weeks of fighting, which is now 3 weeks as of today, 3 weeks of fighting, than the U.S. military has lost since Afghanistan combined. Now, we've had 20 years fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. 20 years. The Russians just lost more military personnel in 2 weeks than the U.S. military lost in 2 decades. Staggering. So, as that's taking place, and they're losing tons of aircraft, they're losing tons of armored vehicles and tanks and tons of soldiers, and they have mass defecting. They put all of the troops that they had on the border, they put them inside, 100% of them, and still they're getting bogged down, literally and metaphorically. They're getting bogged down in the mud, and the Ukrainians are mounting a stiff resistance, staunch resistance, and the battle for Kiev is not even close to being a full siege. Not even close. You can still, the Western media is calling it a siege. It's not a siege until you can't get in and can't get out. Kiev is being bombarded, according to Russian methodology, just terrorize the population and break their will, and then at the end move closer and closer and closer, then use chemical weapons, break them, and then in the end you achieve your military purposes through this basic methodology that we talked about earlier. As Russian military advances are stunted, what ends up happening in the Western media and global media is Russia ends up being painted as the bad guy, the aggressor, the invader, and the world reacts to it. Sanctions are imposed. Companies start pulling out, dropping like flies. You have Spotify, Netflix, McDonald's, Boeing. You have all these companies pulling out, saying, when you have Pink Floyd saying we're going to pull all of our music, no one can listen to The Wall anymore in Russia, something significant is happening. So all these companies are closing down. McDonald's is pulling out. I mean, the long list of companies, the sanctions, the oligarchs of all these Russian billionaires and quadrillionaires all over the world, they're getting their yachts seized. And everyone is turning in the tide. Everyone's putting the Ukrainian flag on their social media. We stand with Ukraine because the world loves, particularly the Western world, loves the underdog. We don't like bullies. Putin is a bully. There's been a long-standing let's say, social conditioning in the United States to believe that Russia is the bad guy no matter what, even no matter what they're doing, they're the bad guy. In the 80s and 90s, all the bad guys in all the Hollywood movies were Russians and spoke Russian accents until 9/11. Then it shifted to, the Arabs are the bad guys and the Russians kind of took the back seat for a little while, but now the Russians are coming back into the equation. So as this is mounting, the Russians never once mentioned anything about any biolabs. No one mentioned anything. Now, the day of the invasion, this is, and I'll put some graphs up here. You can mine the data of when certain words are used, what sites, how many sites are using the phrases, and you can track the algorithm of when something is being fed to the public. Now, this is why I said at the beginning, this isn't so much to explore the biolab thing, but actually it's to explore the nature of information acquisition, specifically in the time of war. To be clear, timeline. Invasion happens. Putin says the reason is to denazify and because of the threat of NATO. No mention of biolabs, no mention of chemical warfare and the need to, put their hand and protect from the outbreak of some chemical attack. There's no mention of that. No mention of that at all. And if you look at the graphs, you have something like 15 biolabs. There's something like 15 posts globally about it before the invasion, before the 24th. Now, what ends up happening on the 24th, there's a guy from an account called War Clandestine. It's a Twitter handle. He's a QAnon guy. Now, the account was banned because the QAnon wackos are getting banned all the time, and they're changing their names because of all these crazy conspiracy theories, and they're constantly getting banned because they're saying stuff. This is what he says the day of the invasion. Holy shit, I think I may be onto something about Ukraine. Hashtag Ukraine. Zelensky said the Russians are firing at military installations. I am seeing speculation that this could include U.S.-installed biolabs. At first, I was like, no way. Then I started digging. This is the first mention of biolabs. A guy that says, holy shit, I'm onto something. At first, I was like, no way. Just a word of advice. When someone is blowing the whistle on something, if they're blowing it and they're saying, I was like, it's probably not a legitimate source. No offense to Mr. War Clandestine here. So, what ended up happening is that this, in the QAnon world, this began to kind of spread a little bit because people saw it and went, oh my gosh. Now, at the time it posted it, it went on Facebook as well, and it had 3 comments for a couple days. That was it. So, one mention of it on a QAnon Twitter handle, and then it gets posted on Facebook, and then it gets 3 comments, and no one picks up on it. Now, his post ends up exploding because it gets on a QAnon forum. Now, the QAnon forums, if you've ever looked at them, are crazy. I'm not going to get into the QAnon thing now, but everything about it is connected to Epstein and Maxwell and Fauci and Hunter Biden and. So the actual the biolab, this is one of the first. It's called Censored Thinker Fitness. Is the Twitter handle. One of the first whistleblowers in the biolabs is this. It's are Jeffrey Epstein, Dr. Fauci connected to Ukrainian biolabs? If you want to rile up a large contingent of people in the United States, all you have to say is Fauci. If you say Fauci, it's throwing blood, chum in the water, so to speak, with sharks, because Fauci is not exactly a popular guy, and for good reason he's not a very popular guy. And we're going to get to this in a minute. The intersection of American rage at the media and American rage at anything associated with Fauci or the elites or whatever. So naturally, at the very beginning, the guy says, hey, there might be biolabs in Ukraine. And Zelensky says that they're targeting military targets, but actually it looks like they're targeting biolabs. Now, the next evolution of it on the forums was Fauci's involved as well. This must be where they're developing the COVID-19 conspiracy. And then from there it goes off and it evolves into some other things. Now, by Tuesday, this is the following week, China's Foreign Affairs Ministry picks up on all the chatter, and they are reporting on it that this is starting to circulate on social media. This is Tuesday, okay? Now, that Wednesday, Tucker Carlson goes on Fox News and leads with his show. The headline is Biden Administration Funding Secret Biolabs in Ukraine. Now, what ends up happening after Wednesday is for the first time, we see the Russians clamp down on it. Now, in Russian media at this point, after 2 weeks, we're 2 weeks into the conflict at this stage, okay? 2 full weeks. And the Russians are saying Nazis, 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 NATO, 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 Nazis, 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 NATO, NATO, NATO. And now everything shifts to biolabs the day after Tucker Carlson's thing. And the day after Tucker Carlson's thing, you can look at the graph, and it goes from biolabs. There's nothing on the internet of biolabs. And then if you look and you compare, I'll try to put this on the screen. If you compare in the United States and then you compare in Russia, it's crazy to watch. As soon as the QAnon guy breaks it, it's kind of, you see a little dip. And then when you see the QAnon forums, you see a little bit of a dip. But then you see Tucker Carlson, it goes, wow. Not only in the United States, but it also blows up in Russia. Now, Russia changes its tune and starts saying, Yeah. That's actually the reason why we invaded, was biolabs. There's biolabs there, and we're actually trying to protect the world from these biolabs, because the United States has conspired with the Ukrainians to build this puppet CIA-run state so that they can attack the Russians, because the Russians don't want to invade. We're peaceful. We're not here to invade. I mean, we were 2 weeks into it, and the foreign minister, the spokesperson for the Russian government, is saying, because Zelensky said, hey, after they invade us, we found plans, they're also going to invade, and they're going to annex parts of Moldova and other countries in the Eastern Europe. And so that prompted the Russian government to respond and say, no, we're not going to invade any other countries, just like we're not invading Ukraine. And hold on a second. You're not invading Ukraine? What do you call this? They said, no, this is not an invasion. It's not an invasion. What we're doing right now is trying to eliminate the biolabs. And you go, well, guys, you just been saying for, like 6 months, you're not going to invade Ukraine. You're not going to invade Ukraine. Then you invaded Ukraine. Then for 2 weeks, you've been saying Nazis, NATO, Nazis, NATO, Nazis, NATO. And then now it's biolabs. So which is it, guys? What's the deal here? In other conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, it's kind of clear what the conflicts are over most of the time. In this case, the Russians are going, no, we're not doing it at all. And then it's all about Nazis. It's all about NATO. Now it's all about biolabs. Now, what ends up happening in all of this that's just so fascinating to me is that Tucker Carlson goes on Fox News and says, this is the headline, someone needs to explain why there are dangerous biological weapons in Ukraine. And he does this long program on it. Now, to be fair, there was confusion that happened at that time because there was a hearing in D.C. at the time, and Marco Rubio ends up asking somebody about it. And the individual ends up mentioning biolabs. From there, it spirals out of control in the D.C. thing and becomes a very partisan thing. Now, you have another female politician in the United States, in the D.C. orbit, who is very pro-Assad. She went to Syria, caused a lot of controversy, because why is a U.S. politician going and standing with the Syrian regime in the midst of this horrific civil war? She gets accused of being a Russian agent. It's this whole thing. Mitt Romney ends up saying that she's committing treason and that she should be held accountable, and now everyone's attacking Mitt Romney. Now, if you trace all this back and you go, okay, you've got the team Mitt Romney and you got the down with Mitt Romney thing, and you've got the Marco Rubio thing, and you've got this, and you got Tucker Carlson, and you trace it all the way back and you go, where did this thing come from? It's some guy who said, holy shit, I think I found something. I was like, I didn't think this was happening, but then I was like, oh, maybe it is happening. This is a critique on information acquisition. Let's be clear about biolabs. There are biolabs all over the world. If you're living in the Western world, you can drive probably no more than an hour from wherever you are and go find a biolab. If you live near a local community college, you can find a biolab. Now, if you're living in the Middle East, if you're living in the Far East, if you're living in Eastern Europe, if you're living anywhere in Europe, you can find biolabs all over. You're going to find them for all different categories and kinds of biolabs. And you can find out where the biolabs are in Ukraine as well, and you can see what kind of biolabs there are. Now, interestingly, if you look at the maps where the biolabs are in Ukraine, the airstrikes and the military campaign is actually not aimed at any of the biolabs. So this is another strange piece of the talking point puzzle that people haven't asked this question. When you look at the map and go, where is all the main military objectives? Where's all the main hot spots in Ukraine? It's not where the biolabs are. So you go, hold on, Russia. When you said biolab and you struck the maternity center and you bombed over 110 hospitals, did you think that maybe those were the biolabs? When you were bombing the civilian apartment centers indiscriminately, and the schools and the pediatric centers, were you thinking that maybe those were biolabs? Because the actual biolabs you haven't hit yet. Now the argument would then go, well, they don't want to hit them because if they hit them, it would cause, the chemicals would get out and it would create this massive nightmare. And so this is one of the arguments in D.C. is saying, look, we need to protect them. And the Russians they're trying not to hit the biolabs because they don't want to create a biolab crisis. Biolab, biolab, biolab. Now, the more that people tweet about it and the more that people report on it, the more the algorithm grows and it becomes a key main talking point. Now, imagine that you're right now with your family in a bunker in Kiev, in the capital, and the Russians are launching airstrikes and shelling the apartment complex a couple blocks away, and you're down underground, and you hear your apartment complex being obliterated by Russian shelling and airstrikes. Think about how it would feel to get on your phone and see the American population saying, whoa, biolabs. We shouldn't intervene in this thing because maybe what the Russians are doing is actually doing a favor to the world, because maybe Fauci and the CIA have been conspiring to do biological warfare and they've been using Ukraine as a base for it. Maybe the Russians aren't actually the bad guys in this whole thing. Maybe it's the American left and it's the global elites, and maybe there's a very sophisticated conspiracy that revolves around biolabs and biowarfare. Now you can see it in Russian media. It's hilarious. Some of the Russian media, they're saying all the conspiracy theories, how it's spiraled out in Russia and the way that they've interpreted it and the way that they're reporting on the biolab thing now. And what I want to point out, guys, is that up until February 24th, no mention of biolabs from anybody. The Russians didn't care about it. No one in the media cared about it. And then from the 24th, 2 weeks, no one said anything about it except for the QAnon guy. And then the QAnon guy gets knocked off the internet again because he's crazy. And then it starts trickling around in the forums, and still nobody's talking about it, nobody cares about it. Because if you said, for example, today, there's biolabs in Germany, you'd be like, yeah, of course there's biolabs in Germany. There's biolabs in Orlando. That doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy in Orlando to, that the CIA is running this deep state thing in order to do this, and this. Now, I want to be clear here. I don't know the details of what all these biolabs are doing any more than I know what the biolabs in other countries are doing. Because the nature of biolabs is that they're biolabs. Like, if you think that you can figure that out real quickly, what every biolab in the world, and there's a bajillion of them, because it's not like, when you say biolab, what it's doing now in people's minds and psychology is it's making people think something other than what a biolab is. Meaning, you can go to your local community college and find a biolab in the local community college. You can go to your local hospital in LA or Birmingham or wherever you live, and you can find a biolab. There's medical research facilities all over the world. Now, specifically in Eastern Europe, you're going to have an emphasis on biolabs for very obvious reasons. There's been kind of a long-standing conflict in the region between the Western powers and Russia. It's kind of a thing. This has been going on for a while. The point is this, and this is where I wanted to get to in terms of information acquisition here. Regardless of the use of a particular biolab in Kiev, for example, or a biolab in, let's say, Berlin, or a biolab in Tel Aviv. I mean, good Lord, you know how many biolabs in Tel Aviv there are? How many medical research facilities in Israel there are? Now, if you want to go and start digging and connecting Fauci and the mainstream media and the Bidens and Hunter Biden, if you want to go start in Jeffrey Epstein, you want to weave together a conspiracy, you can do that. You can, but I would advise you not to do that, because once you start doing that, you actually start rotting your brain, and it becomes this psychological sickness and poison to where you actually can't view reality for what it is, because you're not seeing what's actually happening. You're actually creating an alternate reality of what's not happening. Are you saying, Dalton, are you saying that there is no ulterior motive or use in these biolabs, that there's no bio-warfare potentially possible in all of this? That's not my point at all, guys. My point is to say this, is that The process of information acquisition in our generation is incredibly horrible because we're losing our ability to think critically. And here's the reason why. I'm saying all that to say this. Over the last number of years, we've seen a phenomenon take place in the realm of the abuse of journalism and media. What it's done is it's inoculated people to the issue of media altogether. Or I could say it this way. It's made people not trust media at all, and for good reason. Now, the thing is, during, let's say, the Trump administration, and then during the COVID years, we watched the media function much more like a propaganda machine than journalistic entities. You know, the whole Russia controversy that was exploding for Trump's administration. The media was using their journalistic powers to accomplish political purposes. This is not the point of journalism. Now, if you want to be a politically activistic entity, be a politically activistic entity and be clear about it, but don't call it journalism. Now, this is very dear to my heart because I've been in war zones and I've been watching as propaganda spirals out of control and people can't get a handle on what's actually happening. I'm going to continue this line of thought in a moment, but I want to interject a story for me that was incredibly burdensome and still is. It was very painful to experience this whole thing. Now, I was in Syria during the time when Trump greenlit Erdogan's invasion of Rojava. Rojava is the Kurdish-controlled areas that was controlled by ISIS from 2014 to 2019. Now, the Kurdish forces, backed by the U.S.-led coalition, pushed ISIS out, took back Raqqa, the capital of the caliphate, liberated everything east of the Euphrates, and set in place one of the only stable places in the Middle East. Now, as soon as they liberated all the areas, Erdogan built a wall to protect himself against the terrorists, even though there was no border fence at all during the ISIS years, and Erdogan was aiding and embedding ISIS throughout the ISIS years. Then, once ISIS is territorially defeated and the Kurds take control of everything east of the Euphrates, then Erdogan says, the terrorists are here, we need to protect ourselves from the terrorists. So, what the U.S. military did is went in and started doing joint patrols with the Turkish military and all of the installations along the border. And the Kurds started saying, they're going to invade. And the Trump administration, the Erdogan said, no, we're not going to invade. We're doing joint patrols to make sure that everything's kosher. Don't worry about it. Give them access. Let them see where your positions are. And then Trump asked the Kurds to withdraw from the positions that he showed the Turks. What happened shortly after that? The Turks invaded. It was a brutal, brutal military campaign. I have friends who were killed by Turkish drones. One of my dear friends was in his ambulance vehicle that was targeted by a drone strike multiple times. I don't know how he survived the whole thing, and he was doing casualty care throughout this whole thing. And the Turks are targeting civilians. The Turks are targeting through drones and snipers and shelling and airstrikes, and they're still doing it to this day, by the way. As of this week, the Turks are still conducting airstrikes in Kurdish areas in Iraq and in Syria with total impunity. Now, what happened is during that time, there was a ceasefire brokered. I don't know if you remember this. This is back in October and November of 2019. Now, during the alleged ceasefire, there was supposed to be a ceasing of fire. Now, the thing is, there was never a ceasefire. People were dying every single day. I was in the hospital watching the wounded come in, watching the dead come in. We were on the ground witnessing it, and President Trump was saying the ceasefire is holding nicely. And if you said, no, there's no ceasefire here, guys. There's no ceasefire. Now, what I saw from the right, the pro-Trump conservative contingent in the United States, is because we were very vocal about it on social media. We said, guys, this is horrific. Erdogan is using the junkyard dogs of jihadists, proxy militias, to invade one of the only stable places in the Middle East that was just liberated from ISIS. This is crazy. What's going on? And then Trump would say, no, it's not happening. There's a ceasefire. Erdogan's a good guy. Everything's good to go, and we're pulling out. We're going to secure the oil, and we're pulling out of Rojava. All we care about is the oil. Now, what Trump's base did during that time was they would look at our posts, for example, and we were in communication daily with people in the Trump administration saying, guys, why are you saying this? Why are you saying this? We're sending videos and photos. Look, we're here now. Here's another dead kid. This is actually happening. Why is the Trump administration saying there is a ceasefire? And his administration was saying, I don't know, but this is what's happening. And no one can figure out, why is Trump just totally spinning this thing and lying about it? Now, we did a video during that time and said, the Trump administration is lying to you. The ceasefire is not holding. There is no ceasefire. And we caught so much flack from the American conservative community because they said Trump wouldn't lie because he's our guy, basically. And he said there's a ceasefire. And look, if he is lying, he's probably doing it for good reasons, and let's not rock the boat here. So we had tons of friends and relationships and connections within the political world at that time just kind of turned a blind eye to it and say, sorry guys, there's nothing we can really do here because Trump's made the decision not to do it, and this is the narrative. We got to stick to the narrative. And it was so burdensome to watch the body count stack up and hundreds of thousands of people get displaced from their homes after they just went back to their homes after it was liberated from ISIS. Now, the point is this. On both sides of the fence, the left and the right are guilty of just buying into the narrative of the media on one hand, if their guy is the one saying it, meaning in that case, the right was guilty of just saying, well, Trump said it's true, so it must be true. He was lying. It wasn't true. And in the same way, the Biden administration has been lying over the last number of years about the COVID situation. Totally lying about it. Fauci's been lying about it. The CDC's been lying about it. Making up stuff and then imposing policies and taking away people's liberties and freedoms on the basis of a trumped-up situation that has some degree of truth to it, but it's been used to way overshoot the runway. And now the general public in the United States is saying we don't trust the media at all. So what happens, I say all that to say this, what happens when the media comes and tells you that there are biolabs or there are not biolabs, or the biolabs are sinister or the biolabs are not sinister? Maybe Putin is a good guy, maybe Putin is a bad guy. Depending on the source of the media and your political persuasion, you're not going to make a judgment as an American. You're not going to make a judgment about what's taking place based on what's taking place. You're going to make a decision based on where the information is coming from, meaning does it come from someone that you like ideologically or not, and you're going to grab a hold of that information and handle it and interpret it and use that information if it makes the other guys on the other side of the ideological divide, if it makes them look stupid, or if it makes them look evil, or if it makes them look conspiratorial. Now, conspiracy as a worldview is taking the world by storm right now. Taking the world by storm. People are connecting dots and things, and the whole media conspiracy over the COVID thing, I think it's actually makes, like, I don't look at the conspiracy thing totally and say, wow, it's really stupid to think that the government would conspire with big pharmacy and big tech. That's crazy. They would never do that. Anyone who believes that is a conspiracy theorist. I believe that people conspire, especially when money and policies and government are on the line. For sure, there's conspiring going on. What I'm wanting to exhort you in this, because I can't tell you how many people have sent me Tucker Carlson's video saying, have you watched this? I go, yeah, I watched it, guys, and it's incredibly discouraging that you have this incredibly significant war taking place right now, like a defining event of our generation taking place, that's connected to so many significant consequential things, that's raging, that's going to affect everything from the Iran nuclear deal to the future stability of Israel to the future of global currencies and China and oil and Saudi Arabia and future military conflicts and future borders of nations. This is massive. And Americans are on Twitter talking about freaking biolabs as if this is some jugular thing in this whole conflict. Guys, it's not. My point is this. I want to exhort you, urge you, yea, even beg you. When you're at a distance, be aware that your distance causes distortion on what's actually taking place. Now, you could say, well, Dalton, what, are you saying that you know everything? No, I don't. I don't know everything. But what I'm saying is this, is my experience of working in war zones and conflict zones in the Middle East, especially where Russia is concerned, things are not as they seem. And the Western media and the people who ingest the Western media are very prone to and very susceptible to buying into false narratives and believing that they are the ones blowing the whistle on the false narrative. This is what's so crazy about it. This is what's so sad about it, is that the people who are so anti-mainstream media right now are blowing the trumpet, so to speak, saying, look what Tucker Carlson figured out about biolabs. Guys, you're falling into the very trap that you're saying that you want to liberate people from. Buying into some social media, big tech narrative, you're doing the exact same thing. You're not, being a critical thinker here. You're actually just being the opposite of a critical thinker here. If you break down the whole thing, okay, Tucker Carlson, bro, his whole segment was to just ask a bunch of questions. What is this? What is that? How is this? What is this? And the thing is, when people ask tons of questions about anything, these are leading questions that take you places that, if you looked at it objectively, it's not actually. You're asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking what is this and why is this and what is this, ask where did this come from in the first place and why is it being so used and emphasized right now when for 6 months no one mentioned it. The Russians didn't care about it at all. At all. They never mentioned it. You're not going to find anything in Russian media, Russian geopolitics, where people were saying, wow, look, the CIA and the United States and Fauci and are conspiring right now in Ukraine and establishing dangerous biolabs for biowarfare against Russia and against the nations of the earth. We're very concerned about this. No one said that. They said, we're not going to invade. Full stop. When the invasion started, everyone said, hey, you guys said you weren't going to invade. And they said, well, we are, and we're doing it because of Nazis. And then everyone went, where are the Nazis? This is a liberal, democratic, left-leaning government that is like so far away, diametrically opposed to like hard right, far right, extreme right, white supremacist, neo-Nazi nationalism. What's the deal? Like, Zelensky's government is like super ultra liberal. What do you mean Nazis? We're aware of the Azov battalion, but that's kind of not really relevant in this whole thing. Are you aware of the history of the Azov battalion in 2014? Are you aware of the relationship between that and the government and why they exist? And are you aware of that? This isn't a thing. You go, no, it's Nazis. And the Ukrainian public goes, we're not Nazis. We're actually liberals. We're a country of mostly left-leaning liberals. We're not Nazis. You're bombing our country because you're a sociopath and you're a dictator and a totalitarian leader of a repressive regime, and we don't want to live under you. That's who we are. We're not Nazis. So they go, okay, well, I guess the Nazi narrative's not going to work. Let's try the NATO narrative. This is because of our legitimate security concerns. Now, when I hear that, I think, oh, it's the same reason Erdogan invaded Rojava after it was liberated from ISIS. Now he brings up security concerns. Erdogan never mentioned security concerns when ISIS was in their backyard. In fact, they left the borders open, and they let ISIS fighters go back and forth freely. Every day, every night, back and forth freely, and they allowed ISIS to operate in northern Syria. But as soon as the Kurds took it, now the Kurds are a security threat, so we have to invade them. So when I hear people use legitimate security threats, sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. And you have to ask the question, why are they saying security concerns? Now, we're going to deal with this in our next session, the issue of NATO and the history of NATO and why this is such a big talking point. Now, if there is a valid, legitimate reason for Russia to say we're invading, it would be because of security concerns, because of expansion of NATO, which is why we're going to do a full session or 2 or 3 on the NATO thing, because it's a significant piece of understanding the context of the war. We'll get to that in another session. But the point is this. No one cared about biolabs. Russia wasn't invading. That was the government position. We're not invading. Then the government says we're invading. Why are you invading? Nazis. That didn't really work. Didn't go down so well. People didn't buy into the narrative. Some crazy people did, but most people didn't. Then they looked at it and they said NATO. Now some people are going, yeah, that's legitimate. Maybe it's because of NATO. And then that still didn't manage to turn the tides globally. The global opposition to Russian expansionism and Russian invasion and Russian aggression is mounting, and Russia is getting further and further isolated. So then they shift and they go, actually, it's biolabs. The biolabs are the thing. I was eating lunch here in the Golan Heights yesterday. I'll close with this. I was eating at a Drew's restaurant, which is former Syrians. Drew won't get into it. But anyway, they're watching Syrian state media in the restaurant. They're watching Syrian TV, and the Russian government, the Russian spokesperson, the who speaks on behalf of Putin, is explaining. He's saying, "Look, we're doing this because of the biolabs." Because people are saying, well, why are you using such extreme measures in civilian population centers? They say, well, because the Ukrainians are using human shields. They're using human shields. They're using an Israeli talking point, saying they're using human shields, and we're just there to root out the biolabs. Go on. And then you see this drone footage of a completely destroyed city, and you see the displacement of now over 3 million people, and you see the death toll mounting and no biolabs being targeted or being even close to where the military campaign is taking place, and you're going, biolabs, huh? So that's the big thing to win public opinion, win the culture war and the information war, biolabs. Now, this is my landing point for you guys as particularly Americans. I know the biolab thing is pretty sexy right now because it's connected to Fauci and because it's connected to COVID, and that everyone globally is pretty sick and tired of the whole COVID game, and everyone's sick and tired of how the media has been playing fast and loose with facts. Don't fall into the same trap of just because that happened to doing the same thing and being guilty of the same thing, of taking something and pushing it way further than it should be pushed and using it to dictate policy and decisions on something on moral, ethical grounds that should not be used to make that decision. That's what we were guilty of, what the government and what the media was guilty of during the Trump administration. Whether you like or don't like Trump, it doesn't matter. The media was absolutely guilty of using their strength and power just simply to tear down the administration, not report the news. And in the COVID years, the media was used as a tool of the government to implement policies that don't really connect scientifically or logically, and they're used to push it way further than the actual truth and reality of the thing would encourage you or allow you to do. Now, this biolab thing is an example of where the right-leaning conservative community in the United States in particular is now guilty of falling into the mirror side of the trap, meaning we don't trust mainstream media. They're always lying to us. So when the mainstream media comes and they tells us that Putin is invading Ukraine and that Putin's the bad guy, we don't trust it. You go, well, why? Because it's mainstream media. It's CNN. CNN lied to us about COVID. They lied to us about the Trump administration. They lied about Russiagate. They lied about this. They lied about that. They're lying about this. Because Russia would never just invade a country for no purpose, especially if it's going to cost them greatly, especially if it's going to cripple their economy, especially if they're going to lose so many of their young soldiers, especially if they're going to pay such a high price for this thing. There must be a reason for it. We don't trust the media. You go, okay, but Russia actually invaded Ukraine, and they said it was because of Nazis and NATO. That's why. So that can't be why. Because why, guys? Because the mainstream media is saying it. Okay, so if the mainstream media says it's sunny today, you would say it's not sunny. That's kind of what you're telling me here. I'm not encouraging you to trust mainstream media. I'm encouraging you to think outside of mainstream media altogether. That's the point of this message. Don't think within the confines of media. Think outside the confines of media and look what's actually happening, not what the media is reporting. Because just because the media is reporting it doesn't mean that it's true, and it also doesn't mean that it is de facto a lie because the mainstream media is reporting it. That's the point. Now, the biolabs thing is just a tiny little example of this, of where people who believe the media is false are now believing the media. They're taking the same thing and going, well, it must be true or it must be false just because they lied to us and just because Fox didn't lie to us. America could be divided into Fox would never lie to us and CNN is always lying to us, or Fox is always lying to you and CNN sometimes lies to you. That's kind of the basic, American view of media today. What I'm encouraging you to do, whether it's biolabs or Nazis or NATO or no-fly zones or a ceasefire in Turkey or legitimate security concerns in the east of the Euphrates or chemical warfare in Syria or name the thing, regardless of what the thing is, don't think within the confines of what the media is saying or not saying. Just because they're saying it or not saying it doesn't mean it's true or not true because they're saying it or not saying it. You have to look at actually what's taking place and what's happening. And guys, it's not that hard. You just have to turn Fox News off. You have to turn CNN off. You actually have to think outside the confines of what popular thought is, because the world is much more complicated than a 12-minute segment on a nightly news cycle that's connected to the financial benefits of the success of that show. It's commercials, it's advertising, it's big money. If you think that Fox News is innocent, whereas CNN and Fauci and is guilty, guys, there's so much hypocrisy in this whole thing. In closing, here's what I want to encourage you to do. We have a great gift today in open source media. You can look any conflict in the world right now and see all the sides of it. You don't need some guy or some girl telling you on the news what's taking place. Day after day, people are saying Kiev is besieged in America on all the news platforms. They're not besieged. They're being shelled, but they're not besieged. This war is far, far, far from over. Now, there might be resolutions and peace agreements in the days ahead, but right now, this war is going to rage for some time, which means the propaganda and the disinformation and the fake news and the manipulation of people's understanding and perception of events is just going to escalate and ramp up. And Jesus said this would happen in Matthew 24. In the last days, there's going to be a lot of deception. Don't be deceived. That's my exhortation to you today in closing. Biolabs, no biolabs. Ceasefire, no ceasefire. Don't be deceived.